Welcome to the Dr. Jennifer Roberts segment of Healing Communities by Removing Highways, a conference held February 22nd, 2024. This conference is hosted by Constance Struther, Eastside Preservation Specialist with Preservation Buffalo Niagara, in association with the Eastside Parkways Coalition.
Join me in welcoming Constance Struther from Preservation Buffalo Niagara.
Thank you, Jeff. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you were able to join us tonight. We have an amazing panel from around the world that's going to share information that can help Buffalo solve this problem of what we need to do with the Kensington 33 and how we can join and bridge community together and reduce health issues and sickness and low baby rates and all kinds of things that have been happening for the last 6 or 7 decades since the time when it was put in for the Kensington 33. So I'd like to start off with our first panelist, Dr. Jennifer Roberts. Jeff, could you give me the screen, please? So here are our guest speakers for tonight. We have Dr. Jennifer Roberts, formerly from Buffalo, New York. She's the founder and director of Public Health Outcomes and Effects for Built Environment Laboratory of University of Maryland, and she's formerly from Buffalo, New York. We also have John Norquist, a former Milwaukee mayor who oversaw the removal of the Park East Freeway in Milwaukee. He was mayor for 4 terms. And we also have Lanessa Owens Chaplin. She's also an attorney and the director of Racial Justice Center in New York City for New York CLU. So our first speaker tonight will be Jennifer Roberts, and she will talk about health outcomes and the effects on a built environment. So I'm going to pass this on over to Jennifer.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. It's a pleasure to be joining you all this evening. I believe that the purpose mainly for my portion of this webinar is to discuss topics related specifically to environmental racism and how that relates to nature inequities, and subsequently why, when we talk about all this, why there should be a complete restoration of Humboldt Parkway. So I want to first really start briefly with the story in which the term environmental racism was derived. This is a Washington Post article from 2021, and it shows a photo from the 1982 protest that was occurring in Warren County, North Carolina. And that was a community that was predominantly African-American, predominantly local farmers, and they were protesting the dumping of soil that was laced with polychlorinated biphenyl, which is basically PCB. It is a carcinogen, and it was used a lot in industrial and consumer products. And so this community was really protesting because obviously they didn't want this soil to be dumped on the grounds in which they did their farming. And this protest was actually considered one of the earliest environmental justice actions in the United States. And specifically what happened was you had Ben Chavez, who was really a civil rights leader of the time, and he actually coined the term environmental racism. And what really happened was that, presumably you can see that it is an environmental injustice where you have this soil that's laced with this carcinogen being dumped into this poor Black farming community. But what was interesting is that when Ben Chavez, he went to go pick up some protesters who had gotten arrested. He was then pulled over by a trooper. And when the trooper pulled him over, he said, "You were driving too slow." And then he subsequently arrested him. And when he was arrested and thrown in jail, he stated explicitly, "This is racism, this is environmental racism." And it's really interesting because, the statement within the context of the PCB protest, him being pulled over as a Black man driving in the South, it encompasses so many other aspects of the definition of environmental racism. So roughly about 6 or 8 years later, the definition was then expanded, and Dr. Robert Bullard, who was considered the father of environmental justice, he basically defined environmental racism as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages where intended or unintended individuals, groups, or communities based on race. And so I really wanted to kind of lay out that groundwork to kind of define environmental racism. But before I get really into the specifics of nature and equity, I feel compelled to start a little bit at the beginning of the story. It's hard for me to just kind of jump in and start talking about inequities. I like to really go back to almost the very beginning, the beginning of the country. And so I showed this slide just pretty much for a visual to show you the large hundreds of years of African enslavement, and then how that subsequently went into, to the Jim Crow era. And while many remember, slavery as this regional institution in the South, it really, in fact, was so much more. And it really laid the groundwork for a lot of the policies and the practices that are baked into a lot of the anti-Black racism that we see today. And so if we move forward to the emancipation period, you have this Reconstruction period where you had a lot of Black Americans who were presumably free, presumably had the right to vote, presumably citizens. They were still very much systematically impoverished and disenfranchised and marginalized primarily through two mechanisms, through Black codes and the sharecropping system. So these codes were just restrictive. Everything from you could get arrested for being a vagrant, you could get arrested for not having a job, and then you had the sharecropping system, which was just a perpetual system to keep people who were formerly enslaved now free in the state of permanent poverty. Then you also had this kind of flooding of this extra level of violent white supremacy that was very, very violent. And so during this period, you had over 3,400 lynchings that were occurring. In addition to all this, you also had convict leasing that was going on. So if you didn't have a job, then like I said, a Black code could deem you as a vagrant. Then you get arrested. And if you were arrested, you were kind of forced into this system where it was maybe an innocuous crime or not even a crime at all. But in essence, this was the state's way of getting that free labor that they had lost because of all these people being free. And so you can imagine how all of these conditions made people want to flee. And so when you had the Great Migration, which many people have known a lot about in the sense that it kind of mirrors the waves of World War I and World War II, you see that people were fleeing the South to get a better life, get better economic and social conditions. And kind of happened in two waves. And there were many, many different destinations where people were going to try and get a better tomorrow. And one of those was actually Buffalo. And so we see that, even before actually the Great Migration, Buffalo definitely was a state or a city, I should say, where it was a popular setting during enslavement because of its proximity to Canada. But even still, after the Emancipation Proclamation, we see how the Black population is increasing significantly, increased 145% in 1980. And then again, during both the first wave of the Great Migration and then the second wave of the Great Migration, it increased almost 200%, and then again, the population doubled. So you can definitely see between 1940 and 1970, the African-American population grew over 400%. Subsequently, the white population declined in Buffalo. Now, during the second wave of the Great Migration, the development of suburbs in the U.S. was greatly accelerated. This is due to transportation, housing production, landscape preference, social and demographic trends, which is really just a nice way of saying, a lot of white folks started to say, I really don't want to live next to people of color. I want to go to these other suburban areas. And so you started to have this mass acceleration of suburbanization. And so specifically in the United States, you see these racial residential segregation patterns that have these two historic roots. One was the first of the Great Migration, which I showed a significant amount of Black Americans left the South and went to all of these cities throughout the Northeast, the Midwest, and out West. And then the second was through the relocation of white folks to cities in suburban rings, or outside of cities into suburban rings. And so in essence, when we think about the whole kind of the engine that kind of drove suburbanization, particularly in the 50s, we see that, first you have World War II that ended, the economy was stimulated, therefore people were excited because they had a little bit more money in their bank account. The soldiers came home, they got married. And so this is still the largest baby boom of the generation. There was like, I don't know how many babies that were happening like every 6 seconds. Oh, there it was, every 7 seconds, a baby was born. And so you also had the GI Bill. So you could come home, not only did you get married to your sweetheart, you started a family, you were able to go to school and you were able to actually buy a house for very little down. I mean, the lowest in history. However, these GI Bills were very much catered for white families to get homes in suburbs. Again, you had this consumerism because, like I said, you had extra income or disposable income, I should say. And so you had this increase in automobile purchases, primarily because you were now living in the suburbs. So this whole auto mania was going on during this time. And this was the very first time that people were living further from their jobs. They're able to go on drive-through restaurants, vacations, a whole lot of different things changed because during this period, you went from like 1940, where 60% of Americans owned cars, to the 60s, where you had 80%. And many of these households had 2 cars. And so ultimately, this drove more and more segregation that we see in many cities and in Buffalo. And this map shows, even if you can't even read what it is, you see definitely on the west side or west of Main Street, it's all blue, which is predominantly white. And then on the east side, it's predominantly Black, which is all green. So in addition, during this time, there were many racist tactics that were taking place to keep Black residents in segregated areas in Buffalo. And this is not just isolated to Buffalo, this happened in many other cities. And you see that one of those programs was urban renewal. Before I get into urban renewal, I want to talk a little bit about the Interstate Highway Project. So again, with the new homes in the suburbs, automania, we needed a more efficient way for people to get from the city center to their homes. And here you had the Interstate Highway Project that was developed with this suburbanization in mind. Second, city planners saw that these crowded African-American or BIPOC neighborhoods as, quote, unhealthy areas, quote, blighted, and they needed to be removed, cleared out, redeveloped. This came in the form of the urban renewal programs that we see in Buffalo and throughout the nation. So by the 50s, highways were recommended as the, quote, greatest single element in the cure of city ills. That was actually written in a DOT report. And so there was federal funding to cover the building of these highways. And so you had cities and states who were basically getting this covered for almost 90% of the cost. And so why not, let's build a highway. It can make us more efficient. And a lot of cities were trying to keep up with other cities because some cities were growing highways faster or building highways faster. But in any case, you saw that this was kind of this highway craze that was going on during this time. So when it was decided in Buffalo where to put one of our highways, we know the rest of the story of where it was placed, where we had a complete excavation of Humboldt Parkway, and we had this 6-lane highway that was put in the form of the 33. So this highway not only bifurcated the community, but it removed a significant source of nature. And it also disconnected the community that was around Humboldt Parkway from the 2 connecting parks. Furthermore, it denied the community the ability to use this green space thoroughfare to those parks or to other destinations. You heard stories about people saying, I would ride my bike, to Albright Knox, or I would ride my bike to Delaware Park. So you removed all of that when that Humboldt Parkway was removed. And so when you think about this, you don't necessarily think about the green space absence. A lot of people are like, well, why does it matter? Well, I'll get to why it matters in a minute. But I just wanted to kind of really emphasize the absence of that green space and what it did to the community. So I'm going to pivot right now and talk a little bit about redlining and how that is related to nature and equity. So here is a homeowners loan corporation security map from 1935-37. And this is of Buffalo. And so we can see definitely where the red line areas are. So those are the areas that are more hazardous because, there's either African Americans live there or sometimes very impoverished white immigrants. But basically, these were the areas that were going to be disinvested. These were the areas that were not going to get the beautiful trees. They were not going to get the beautiful parks or the landscaping because you were going to put all that investment into the A neighborhoods, which were deemed green as the best. And so you may think, well, how does that impact health? Like, what's the big deal if I don't have green space in my neighborhood? Well, it definitely does. And sometimes people think, well, that was a long time ago. How is that impacting us right now? Well, this is an example that shows an illustration of a map. This was published in 2020 in New York Times. And it shows that something as simple as not having green space, not having adequate tree canopy, you are exposed to a higher heat burden. And so when you look at this is a map of Richmond, Virginia. It shows clearly that areas that were formerly redlined have less tree cover today than the areas that don't. And so if you look at, let's just say 2 neighborhoods and 1 in each area. Sorry, before I get to that, this right here shows the, on the right where you see less tree cover, and then obviously you see how there is a higher temperature in the areas that were redlined. The temperatures are anywhere from 5 to 25 degrees hotter. Like that is how much of a differential you see, especially in the summer. And we see the same phenomenon in many cities, Baltimore, Dallas, Denver, even Buffalo. And so when you look at just 2 neighborhoods, one Westover Hills, that is in the area that was not redlined, and Gilpin in the area that was redlined, we can almost guess who lives in those neighborhoods. But what's interesting is not only we can guess that, you know, Gilpin is predominantly Black, Westover is predominantly white, we can almost even guess that there is a, you know, a 5-fold difference in household income. But what a lot of people don't realize is that there is a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And you may say, okay, well, is this disparity in life expectancy? Is it all attributed to nature gap? No, it's not all attributed to nature gap, but this is one of those things which we call social determinants of health. And all of the poor social determinants, they tend to stack up. Meaning, if you're living in an area that is a nature gap, it's probably also a food desert. It's probably also a transit desert. Poor quality schools, inadequate access to healthcare. It just keeps stacking up on top of each other. And as a result, you see how in one area there is really a survival deficit. We also see this in Buffalo. So here's 2 identical maps. I just put the 2 up for the sake of comparing. First, you can clearly see that there's a difference between the west side of Main Street, which is much more green than the east side of Main Street. But let's take a look at some of the specifics of the equity score of 2 different census blocks. So here, there's a score of 99 versus here on the east side, this is another census block that has a score of 67. So what does this mean? This means that on this one, the tree canopy goal is almost achieved. They have a tree canopy cover of 28%. Their goal is 30%. On the east side of this census block that has a score of 67, they are at a deficit of about 25%. They're only about halfway there. And so you can see that on the left, it's pretty much a low priority. On the right, it's a high priority to plant more trees, get more greenery into that area. But what is interesting is not just the fact that it's a low or a high priority, it's basically how they were able to really not only categorize the priority levels, and they categorize really by looking at these other priority indexes. So the priority index is actually encapsulated within the actual score. And if you look at these 2 different comparisons, that priority index, it is composed of social demographic factors like people of color, unemployment. So if you look at the 2 comparison over here, people of color is only like 13% versus here, it's 100%. Poverty is at 3/4 of the population versus poverty is less than 20%, unemployment 4% versus 20%. So all of these factors, they are weighted and they are actually put into prioritizing the need for more green space. And as you can see on the east side, there's many areas that have these low 67, 65 type of scores, meaning that it's definitely a deficit of nature. And so finally, I want to get to the point of saying, well, why does it matter? Because these are all of the benefits that you can get from nature. It not only reduces your blood glucose, your blood pressure, heart disease, stress, anxiety. You get a boost of vitamin D, it boosts your mood. I mean, there's many, many others. I just put some of the highlights here on this slide. But this is an impact, and it's an impact that is not only just seen in Buffalo, but it's seen around the nation. This is another article that was published in the National Geographic, and it's basically said how nature-deprived neighborhoods impact the health of people of color. And so it's really important that we really take this and look at this seriously, because nature's not just a nice to have, it really is something that is essential for the benefit of our public health. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. Professor Roberts, it's so lovely that you took the time to be here with us. With